Hello, everybody. I just wanted to give you some updates about the unit that we're on. I want to talk a little bit about the yellow wallpaper, and I would like to kind of point you in the direction of some resources that you can use as you're beginning to think about writing the draft of your third paper. So, a lot of what we're doing, as you probably have seen, is review of what we had done previously. So, for example, in the first paper, it was just literary devices. You were figuring out how a poem worked based upon your understanding of figurative language and literary devices. In the second paper, we added the concept of existentialism on top of that. So, for instance, you were looking at how literary devices and how dramatic structure contributed to our understanding of things like freedom and things like our ability to live meaningful lives. In the final paper, you're really kind of creating whatever perspective you want using outside sources to demonstrate some thematic presence in a text. Another way to think about this is that you're placing a lens over the ideas that you're going to be examining. So you can look at a text through a number of different perspectives. You can look at specifically characters, you can psychoanalyze those characters. Maybe you look at the way that it exposes power structures. Maybe you look at the way that it exposes gender. But regardless of what you do, it's better if you take a look at one of these sources as opposed to all of them together. And so hopefully you've been able to go through and take a look at the literary theory overview up here and see some of the different theories that you have at your disposal. For instance, feminist perspective is what we're going to be looking at exclusively. Specifically, it shows how female perspectives have been repressed by a predominantly patriarchal social structure over the last several centuries. And it shows how it is that people access power, specifically how men and women access power differently as a part of that structure, as a part of that patriarchal structure. And so when we're looking at this, we're looking at a text in terms of what it reveals about society more so than just the story. And if you remember way back to the beginning of the semester, I was talking about how specific texts weren't necessarily valuable or weren't specifically important because of the story that they tell, but because of what they allow us to access and understand regarding the society that created that story or the society that made that story popular, that published that story. And so, how is it that we can better understand the human condition or the human perspective as a result of the stories that we tell and the stories that we retell and revere? So that's really what we're doing, and I'm going to talk more about that as we get into the assignment. But I want to very briefly, and I'm going to point to some resources on the yellow wallpaper in terms of analysis. But it's really, really easy to label the yellow wallpaper a story about a woman who goes crazy, right? About her madness or her descent into madness. And clearly we see that, right? We see her move from this very rational position to this very irrational position. But there's so much more at work than that. For example, Charlotte Perkins Gilman allows us to see the female protagonist as rational at the beginning, right? And we have a lot of different ways that we can envision that person. But the fact that we see her as rational and then we see her slowly transition to irrational, that becomes really important. The other thing is that the things that she says always seem as though they're based in some kind of fact or some kind of reality. It makes sense. We can understand her perspective and her frustration. But as she describes this house, as she describes this place where they go, it tells us a lot of things. For instance, the fact that it's situated in the countryside, that it looks like this, it looks like an estate, that it's an abandoned estate, and that there's remnants of people who have been there before all become really important. But the fact that this couple can afford to leave their house while it's being renovated and go to this other place in the country gives us a socioeconomic signifier. So we can figure out like where in society they're placed. They probably have some money. And so we see that her husband is a doctor. That gives us a socioeconomic indicator. It also gives us another set of evaluative tools as we start looking at our sources in a little bit. So we see her status in society, we see their monetary status, and then we begin to see the perspective of uh, Jane, the female protagonist here, the narrator, and her husband, right? And so we see her framing herself as um, trusting her intuition and trusting her instinct and trusting her feelings. Whereas her husband is what she calls it at the very beginning of the story, practical in the extreme. And what practical means is what can be demonstrated, what can be proven, what's tangible, what's there. And what's interesting about mental illness is that it's not something that's tangible. It's not something that you can prove necessarily or lay your hand on, especially at the end of the 19th century. And so her struggles, specifically her postpartum struggles as a mother who can't see herself fitting in this conventional role, become marginalized because they're not tangible. Now, we can validate those as a modern audience, but for contemporary audiences, this would seem like it was kind of giving air to a whim, somebody's whim, but clearly a very real problem. And so the narrator's struggle is the struggle of so many people, of so many women in particular, during this time period. And so we see her essentially being um, locked away, a prisoner in a room with bars, right, and a bed that's nailed to the floor and a gate at the top of the stairs. We see her being kept prisoner in this attic because she can't conform to what would seen as a conventional, traditional, and predominantly patriarchal worldview. And so when we start thinking about how we can look at this, yeah, okay, we could talk about how she may be schizophrenic, or maybe she is developing a borderline personality disorder, or we could be looking at the way in which um, she's depressed, or that she is postpartum. But what's more compelling, maybe, is how is it that those conditions, how is it that those symptoms provide a commentary on something larger than just mental health? And so you're looking at what theories complement the texts that you've read, but you're looking even more specifically at why is it that looking at those texts in that way might be important. And so I want to fast forward, and we'll look a little bit more at yellow wallpaper in a moment, but I want to fast forward here to oop, maybe rewind is what I let's see. Sorry, here it is. To your assignment. Move my floating head here. All right, so when we take a look at the assignment, it basically summarizes what we've already discussed. And so down here it says you should consider the short stories we've read in class, for class, however you want to think about that in our current situation, and select your subject accordingly. You can either look at Story of an Hour, Misery, Cathedral, or the Yellow Wallpaper. And you're going to be closely examining, explicating, analyzing, and creating a reading in the same way that we have. But because the paper is grounded in critical theory, you're going to center your reader on examples gleaned from the text as well as research that substantiates the theory. So for instance, I'm going to skip down here. Let's say that we were going to look at this as a sample thesis. And you can use this as a jumping off point if you want to use the yellow wallpaper, which I think is prudent. I've given you a whole bunch of resources. But if you want to use the yellow wallpaper, you might say something like, your thesis might read something like, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, leverages Gilman's marital experiences as a way to expose the inequities and absurdities inherent to male-dominated 19th century social constructs. So essentially, that the short story is a way to point to problems with 19th century gender structures or power structures. And so it needs to be 5 to 7 pages. You need to have an MLA style bibliography and work, excuse me, a works cited page. Um, but essentially, that's the assignment. Now, I'm going to come back to this. So let's say that's my thesis statement. I'm going to go into this text right here. And I want to look at a couple of ideas. Um, I might have to update this. That's not good. All right, I am going to pause this for just a second. Okay, sorry about that. My link, they changed the location. So, um, as I was saying, so if I needed to go in and I needed to demonstrate that Charlotte Perkins Gilman's marriage is represented in the narrator in the yellow wallpaper, right? I have a secondary text here, which is a commentary on a primary text. So I have a secondary text that I might click on, and I could take a look at how Gilman is seen through the narrator in the yellow wallpaper. And so this is one that I've previewed and selected by Denise Knight, who was a professor at SUNY Cortland. She just recently retired, but great expert on the yellow wallpaper and Charlotte Perkins Gilman in general. And so in here, she has a number of different perspectives on feminism and the yellow wallpaper. So specifically, both Charlotte and Anna Perkins in 1860, Gilman long rejected even the possibility of marriage, believing that wedlock would require a total subordination of what she saw as her life's work, a life dedicated to helping humanity. In 1882, however, after meeting Rhode Island artist Charles Walter Stetson, the 21-year-old Perkins began to reconsider her position on marriage. Still, Perkins' fear of subjugation tempered her enthusiasm for matrimony. To Stetson she wrote, "Were I to marry, my thoughts, my acts, my whole life would be centered in husband and children. To do the work that I have planned, I must be free." A few weeks later she was still in the throes of dilemma. "As much as I love you, I love work better, and I cannot make the two compatible." What I think is interesting, if we look at this in conjunction with the yellow wallpaper, is that we see in the narrator a lot of the sentiments that Charlotte Perkins Gilman's expressed to her own husband. And so she continues here, and if you read, it says, "I have lost power. I do not feel myself so strong a person as I was before. I seem to have taken a lower seat, to become less in some way, to have shrunk." And so we see this loss of power. If I go back to our um, presentation here, we see this loss of power throughout the yellow wallpaper. And so if I'm going to have a thesis where I talk about Gilman's loss of power, right, and specifically if I talk about the way in which Gilman's marriage is represented by the narrator and how that might be typical of a marriage in the 19th century, now I have something to argue. Now I can also begin to look at other sources. And so I'm going to click down here. I have Goeth's color wheel. And so obviously yellow plays a big component in here. The wallpaper is described with something like 20 different shades of yellow throughout the story. And so if we go to Goeth's color wheel, We see this 19th century, so 1800s, 19th century insight into the psychology of color and emotion. So I'm going to scroll down and it just talks a little bit about different colors. And so when he talks about yellow, it talks about yellow is the color nearest to the light. It appears in the slightest mitigation of light, whether by semi-transparent mediums or faint reflection. I want to skip down here. Here we go. In its highest purity, it always carries with it the nature of brightness and has a serene, gay, softly exciting character. Its state is agreeable and gladdening and is in its utmost power serene and noble. It is, on the other hand, extremely liable to contamination and produces a very disagreeable effect if it's sullied or in some degree tends toward the minus side. Thus the color of sulfur, which inclines to green, has a something unpleasant in it. And so when we think about the way the color is described in the yellow wallpaper, and we hold this up against Gilman's attitude towards marriage, we see that yellow on one hand can be this beautiful, powerful, gladdening, and agreeable shade. But if that color is sullied, if that color is contaminated, then all of a sudden it takes on this sulfurous tone. It becomes inclined to green. It has something unpleasant. So what is it that's the yellow? What's agreeable and gladdening? And how is that thing that's agreeable and gladdening somehow contaminated throughout the text? What contaminates, what's contaminated, and what's the effect of that? And can we see that reflected in the wallpaper? Can we see that reflected in color? And so your thesis now can begin to be supported not just by Gilman's experiences, which we see in Denise Knight's text, not just by the color, not just by the text, but by this combination of all of these. So if we think about the way in which you're going to be outlining your paper, you might start off by talking about marriage conventions in the 19th century and how those conventions are manifested in the yellow wallpaper. Then you might move to talk about the psychology of the narrator and talk about her psychological condition and how that is perpetuated by these ideas about marriage or by the way that marriage is framed. And then look at Gilman's perspective and how it's represented by the color, how it's signified by the colors throughout that text. And so if I were to return, I'm going to return here to the presentation. All of the resources that you're seeing here are ways that you can demonstrate through research that the text is more than just a ghost story or more than just a thriller about a woman who begins to go insane. What it really is a commentary on something much larger than just the text of the story. And so there's some excerpts here about thesis creation um, that I want you to consider. I want you to think about creating a provisional thesis based upon one of the texts. I think that if you're struggling, the easiest one to use would be the yellow wallpaper because I've given you all the resources. If you feel as though you have a strong handle and you want to do Story of an Hour, or if you'd like to do Cathedral, then you're more than welcome to do those texts as well. Um, I'm going to, it says annotated bibliography. I'm going to actually eliminate the assignment. You'll see that reflected here. I'll cross it out. Though I think it's useful. I think at this point in the semester and in the situation we're in, I don't think we need to do that. And in my next segment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about MLA style for research papers. And I'm going to have a live Zoom session where you can ask questions about the paper, ask questions about the text. I'll talk a little bit more about the yellow wallpaper in the coming few days. I'll post a remind about that. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. I also am going to have a Zoom time later in the week, general office hours for concerns about anything. And I'm trying to schedule those with one or two people in the session at a time. So more to come on that. So you can look for another update on everything on Wednesday. If you have specific questions, please feel free to let me know. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.